Nobody noticed the silent man sitting there. And that was their first mistake. He occupied a simple bench, leaning against the outside wall of an old cafe, one of those that seemed to have existed forever in small towns in the American Midwest. The wood was worn by time, marked by scratches and layers of old paint, and yet the bench remained sturdy, like the man who occupied it. People passed by him without slowing their pace. Loud conversations filled the air. Laughter escaped through the cafe's half-open door. To everyone else, he wasn't really there. He was just part of the scenery, an irrelevant detail in an afternoon too ordinary to deserve attention. A group of young people crossed the sidewalk, laughing loudly. One of them pointed quickly, without even looking properly. Another cracked a short joke, the kind that doesn't require a response. A third turned his face away disdainfully, as if that man were a visual nuisance, something out of place. None of them stopped. None of them noticed they were being watched. The veteran didn't react. He didn't raise his head. His expression didn't change. He remained silent, not out of shyness, not out of fear, but because silence was the only way to remain invisible. He knew from experience that acting too soon always exposes the one who acts. And he didn't need to be seen. Not yet. As everyone passed by, he counted. Standards, repetitions, errors. His eyes moved barely, almost imperceptibly, following reflections in shop windows, the cadence of footsteps, the exact time each person took to cross the street. He noticed what no one else noticed because no one else was looking for it. A car parked too long in the same spot. An engine turned off, but still warm. A man pretending to use his cell phone while observing the movement around the corner. None of this caught his attention. None of it seemed urgent. But the sum of the small things always spoke louder than any alarm. Nothing would have happened there if no one had made another mistake. The wind swept across the main street, carrying the scent of recent rain and burnt coffee. Dry leaves rustled across the wet asphalt, producing a low, uneven sound. Lights began to flicker on the lampposts before nightfall, reflecting on the dark ground. The city continued its predictable rhythm, comfortable in the illusion that nothing out of the ordinary could happen in a place like that, on a day like that. The veteran remained motionless, not because he was disconnected from the world, but because he was completely present. His body seemed relaxed, but there was contained tension in his shoulders, his jaw, in the way his feet touched the ground, ready to move without warning. He observed because observing was surviving. He had learned this long before returning home, long before that bench became his fixed point in the urban landscape. A woman left the cafe and almost bumped into him. Startled, she mumbled an automatic apology and continued on her way without waiting for a reply. She didn't even notice the attentive gaze that followed her for half a second longer than necessary. To her, that man remained invisible. To him, every interaction was a piece of data to be recorded. The city seemed normal. A radio played softly inside a nearby shop. A door slammed in the distance. A puppy barked twice and fell silent. Everything seemed excessively ordinary. That was the problem. The veteran knew that danger rarely presents itself with noise. It hides in excessive routine, in the blind confidence that nothing will change. His silence was not empty. It was calculated. It was expected. He was on alert. He wasn't there by chance. He wasn't there out of distraction. He was there because he had noticed something out of place long before anyone else. Something too small to become a topic of conversation. Something too subtle to become a concern. But big enough to trigger that instinct that never completely switched off. A red glow pulsed for an instant at the bend in the street. It vanished quickly. To passers-by, it meant nothing. To the veteran, it was just further confirmation. He took a deep, composed breath. He slightly adjusted the position of his feet, not to act, to prepare himself. The world continued to ignore the silent man sitting there, and the error continued to grow. The silence stretched on, heavy and functional, like a line stretched to its limit before breaking. No one felt it. No one noticed. No one imagined that this man, treated as invisible, was already several steps ahead of them all. And he would remain there, observing, waiting. Because when it finally becomes necessary to act, it will already be too late for those who chose not to see it. The veteran's routine always began the same way, even before the city was fully awake. He didn't need an alarm clock. His body learned on its own to open its eyes when the world was still too quiet to be comfortable. The simple ceiling of his room was the first thing he saw. The same old stains, the same fine cracks he knew by heart. He would remain motionless for a few seconds, breathing slowly, checking his own body as one might inspect equipment before a mission. Arms, legs, back, knees. Everything working, everything in its place. Only then would he get up. The house was small, almost excessively organized. There was nothing there that didn't have a clear function. No superfluous object, no unnecessary decoration. Everything had its exact place, and it remained there. The silence of the house wasn't emptiness. It was controlled. He maintained it that way because he needed to. Unexpected sounds, abrupt changes, visual clutter, all of that demanded too much attention. And attention was a resource he economized on. In the kitchen, he always prepared his coffee the same way. Measured water, low heat, precise movements. The aroma spread slowly, mingling with the cool morning air. He drank in silence, standing, looking out the window. The street was still empty, but not completely. A car passed by too early. A light turned on before its usual time. Small details that he registered effortlessly. Not because I was looking for trouble, but because his trained mind didn't know how to switch off. He would leave home shortly afterward, walking through the city like someone who knew all the alternative paths, all the less obvious routes. He never walked in the center of the sidewalk. He never walked distractedly. He observed shop windows not for what they sold, but for the reflection they offered. He used the glass as an extension of his field of vision. People crossed his path. Some vaguely recognized him, others simply avoided him. He didn't seek contact, nor did he avoid it. He remained neutral, invisible when possible. The work he did didn't require constant interaction. Small jobs, simple repairs, solitary tasks. It was enough to live on, enough to not depend on anyone. He preferred it that way. Long conversations required explanations. Explanations generated questions. Questions brought up memories he had no interest in revisiting in public, so he kept everything to the essentials. He answered when asked, never more than necessary. The city accepted him as he was. Not out of deep understanding, but out of habit. He was as much a part of the urban landscape as the park bench, the crooked lamppost on the corner, the old building no one remembered when it had been built. People knew he was there, but they knew nothing about him. And that was exactly what he wanted. Even in the most crowded places, he managed to stay on the sidelines. He always sat with his back to the wall, in a position where he could see entrances and exits. He never chose tables in the center. He never faced doors. It was automatic. He didn't think about it. His body chose before his mind needed to intervene. The hypervigilance wasn't a state of constant alert in the dramatic sense. It was more subtle. A permanent background noise, like a silent radar scanning the environment all the time. He didn't complain about the life he led, nor did he play the victim. He didn't wonder how things could have been different. He accepted the present as something that needed to be managed, not questioned. Isolation wasn't punishment. It was strategy. Emotional distance kept him functional. Closeness, he knew, came at too high a cost. At night, as the city slowed down and the lights went out one by one, he remained alert. Not out of fear of the dark, but because the night silence amplified everything. A step out of rhythm. An engine that shut off too quickly. A muffled conversation that abruptly ceased. For most people, none of this meant anything. For him, it was simply information being processed. Sleeping was never easy. His body rested, but his mind remained in a light state of wakefulness. He would wake up a few times during the night without a start, simply awakening as if called by something invisible. He would look around, confirm that he was where he should be, and close his eyes again. There was no panic, there was habit. The life he led seemed small to an outside observer. Repetitive, unambitious, without grand goals. But that was a superficial reading. He had learned that surviving wasn't about doing more, but about making fewer mistakes, not drawing attention to himself, not creating unnecessary noise. staying out of reach of problems that feed on carelessness. The city continued to live around him, indifferent. Children grew up, shops changed owners, new cars replaced old ones. He observed these changes like someone watching a constant flow, without getting too involved, not because he didn't care, but because he knew what happens when you let your guard down in seemingly safe environments. The veteran lived on the fringes, not out of weakness, but by choice. Invisibility was a shield. Silence, a tool. He observed and endured because it had always worked, and as long as nothing demanded otherwise, he would continue like this, quiet, attentive, prepared. Before the war taught the veteran the true weight of silence, he was already someone who spoke little and observed too much. This didn't stem from trauma, nor was it shaped solely by what he would experience later. It was part of who he had always been, long before he donned a uniform or learned that decisions made in seconds could determine who would return home. He grew up in that same small town in the United States, when it still seemed larger than it actually was. The streets seemed longer, the days more drawn out, and the world ended precisely where the asphalt gave way to the dirt. The house where he spent his childhood was in a quiet area, with a simple backyard and a fence that never needed to be locked. There, silence wasn't absence, it was normality. It was the sound of the wind through the trees, the radio playing softly in the kitchen, the controlled footsteps inside the house. That's where Thomas Hale. He learned, without anyone needing to explain, that observing was as important as acting. While other children spoke too loudly and moved too fast, Thomas would stop. Look, wait. He noticed small things. The way people changed their tone when they lied, the difference between a genuine smile and a forced one. The exact moment when a seemingly calm conversation became tense. He didn't comment, he kept it to himself. At school, he was never the center of attention. Not because he was excluded, but because he didn't seek prominence. He always sat on the sides of the classroom, away from the windows, where he could see everyone without being seen. He paid attention not only to the teacher, but to his classmates, those who were easily distracted, those who were restless, those who always seemed alert. Teachers described him as quiet, but attentive. He was the type of student who didn't ask unnecessary questions, but delivered exactly what was asked. At home, the environment was simple and structured. There were no grand speeches about the future or success. There were clear values, repeated more by example than by words: responsibility, discipline, respect. Thomas grew up understanding that doing what needed to be done was more important than talking about it. He absorbed this code silently, as he absorbed everything. In his adolescence, while many dreamed of leaving as quickly as possible, Thomas didn't feel that urgency. He liked to understand how things worked, how the city was organized, who was in charge without seeming to be, who talked a lot but did little. He watched games on the school field not just for the competition but for the dynamics, who lost control under pressure, who kept their cool when everything went wrong. It was a constant learning process, even if he didn't have the words to define it at the time. When the topic of military service began to surface in town conversations, Thomas listened more than he spoke. There was pride in the accounts of the older veterans, but there were also prolonged silences, awkward pauses, stories that ended too soon. While others heard only superficial heroism, Thomas paid attention to what wasn't said, to the gazes that wandered into the void, to the hands that closed without realizing it. That didn't deter him. On the contrary, it made him understand that this path demanded something more than enthusiasm. The decision to enlist wasn't impulsive or driven by immediate need. It was gradual, almost inevitable. For Thomas, military service seemed a natural extension of who he already was, an environment where discipline, observation, and control weren't weaknesses, but requirements. Where silence could mean survival. Where speaking less and perceiving more made a real difference. When he announced his decision, he didn't make a speech. He didn't ask for approval. He simply informed. Those who truly knew him weren't surprised. Thomas had always chosen paths that demanded restraint. He had always felt more comfortable in roles where responsibility was clear and external noise was minimal. War, at that moment, was still a distant abstraction, a concept, an idea. He couldn't imagine how it would shape every part of his existence, but he knew intuitively that he was prepared to learn. In the months leading up to his departure, he began to observe the city with a different perspective, not one of dramatic farewell, but of silent recording. He walked the streets, memorizing details he had never considered important. The specific sound of the church bells, the smell of the bakeries in the morning, the way the late afternoon light fell on the old facades. He didn't know how long he would be away. He didn't know what would change, so he kept everything. There were people who tried to extract promises, words of courage, declarations of certainty from him. Thomas offered only what was necessary. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He didn't create unrealistic expectations. This self-control, which many mistook for coldness, was actually respect for reality. He didn't romanticize what was to come. He simply accepted it. On the eve of his departure, while the city slept, Thomas sat alone for a long time, listening to the silence that had always accompanied him. At that moment, he did not yet carry the weight of war. He did not yet know the real sound of explosions, nor the constant tension of hostile environments. But he already understood something fundamental. Observation was not passivity. It was preparation. When Thomas Hale left town, he didn't leave as a hero or someone seeking glory. He left as he had always lived, quiet, attentive, aware that the world rarely gives warning before it changes. What he didn't yet know was that this ability to observe in silence, which had always defined him, would be tested to the limit, and that noticing beforehand wouldn't always be enough to save everyone. But he would only learn that later. The war did not reach the life of Thomas Hale. It wasn't an immediate shock, but a slow and corrosive process. At first, she seemed distant, almost abstract, even when he was already immersed in her. The training had been rigorous, exhausting, designed to break down civilian habits and replace them with precise reflexes. Yet nothing there compared to what happened when the silence ceased to be a comfort and became a threat. In his first months in the conflict zone, Thomas quickly realized that survival depended not only on strength or speed, it depended on attentiveness, on noticing what was out of place. A sound that didn't match the environment, a movement too subtle to be casual, a pause too long before a response. While some were still trying to adapt to the brutal rhythm of war, Thomas had already understood that the battlefield was a constantly evolving puzzle, and that ignoring details was the shortest path to not returning. There were times when silence saved lives. Night patrols where he noticed a strange absence of sound, as if nature itself had held its breath. Small decisions made without words, only with minimal gestures, quick glances, almost imperceptible signals. On more than one occasion, it was this silent reading of the environment that prevented his unit from advancing directly into an ambush. He didn't shout warnings, he didn't make speeches, he simply interrupted the movement at the right moment. And that was enough. But the war also taught Thomas that observation is not always enough, that perceiving danger does not guarantee that everyone will listen, nor that everyone will survive. The first significant loss came far too soon. A younger companion, still carrying that dangerous mix of confidence and anxiety, ignored a detail Thomas had noticed. A pattern repeated too often to be natural, a route that seemed too safe. Thomas tried to warn him in the way he knew how. A short comment, a suggestion to wait, a lingering look. There was no time. The mistake happened in seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. There was no cinematic explosion, no heroic cries, only the brutal realization that someone wouldn't be coming back. From that day forward, Thomas's silence took on a new meaning. It ceased to be merely a tool and became a burden. Every detail ignored by others became a personal load. Every unheeded warning was recorded. He began to carry not only his own decisions, but also the consequences of others' decisions. As time passed, the losses accumulated, not all at once, one here, another there, always spaced far enough apart to prevent any real emotional adjustment. Each name added to the previous ones. Each face remained. Thomas didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. His body reacted on its own. His sleep became lighter, his attention sharper. The silence more tense. There were days when he felt less human and more like a machine. He functioned with absolute efficiency. He followed orders, he protected positions, he assessed risks. But internally, something was beginning to crumble. Not visibly, not dramatically. It was a constant erosion, almost imperceptible, like water wearing away stone. The nights were the worst. His body rested, but his mind did not. Distant sounds were processed as immediate threats. His brain insisted on simulating scenarios, repeating situations, revising old decisions as if it were still possible to change them. Thomas learned to live with this in silence, without sharing. After all, in war, talking too much could be dangerous. And he had already learned that silence, even when painful, still seemed safer. In one particular operation, one that would never be mentioned in speeches or public reports, Thomas experienced a moment that completely redefined his relationship with the past. The mission seemed too simple, the environment too calm. That old, unsettling feeling returned. Something didn't fit. He realized it before everyone else, but this time, time was not on his side. The decisions came too quickly, the consequences too immediate. When it was all over, the silence was unlike any other he had ever known. It wasn't the strategic silence before action, nor the respectful silence after a successful mission. It was a heavy, definitive silence. Thomas remained motionless for long seconds, unable to fully process what had happened. There weren't enough words, no explanations could resolve anything, only the certainty that some things cannot be undone. From that day forward, he carried the war within him, even when far from combat. Each new mission was executed with even more restraint, even more calculation, even less room for error. He became someone others instinctively trusted, even without understanding why. Thomas didn't inspire trust through charisma or verbal authority. He inspired it because he was always one step ahead, always alert, always prepared. But this constant preparation came at a cost. The war didn't make him silent, it made his silence heavier, more laden with meaning. Every pause was filled with memories. Every decision came accompanied by ghosts. He didn't talk about it because he wouldn't know where to begin. And deep down, he feared that talking would make everything even more real. When he finally returned home, the battlefield hadn't been left behind. It had merely changed form. His body had emerged from the war, but his mind remained on high alert. The silence of the small town, once familiar, now felt strange, different, incomplete. Something was missing, or perhaps there were too many things hidden within it. Thomas had survived, but survival did not come clean. It came scarred. It came accompanied by an all-too-sharp awareness of the world, of people, of the mistakes that are repeated when no one is paying attention. The war had taught him that danger rarely announces itself, that it usually arrives disguised as normality. And that lesson, deeply ingrained in him, would never leave him. After years of living within a carefully constructed routine to keep the world at bay, the event that began to break the balance of Thomas Haylett didn't arrive with noise, urgency, or fanfare. It didn't come in the form of a shout, an explosion, or a direct threat. It arrived too small to attract attention, too discreet to become a topic of conversation. Exactly the kind of thing most people ignore without a second thought. It was an ordinary afternoon, one of those when the city seemed trapped in repetition. The sky was cloudy, without drama, without vibrant colors. Businesses operated at their usual slow pace. People walked with moderate haste, bound to their own routines. Thomas was sitting on his usual bench, in his usual observation point, when he noticed the first break in pattern. A woman crossed the street outside the crosswalk, something that happened all the time. The detail wasn't the gesture itself, but the timing. She looked both ways before crossing, correctly, and yet hesitated midway. Not out of fear of cars, because of something behind her. Thomas noticed the sudden stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hand involuntarily closed around her purse. The woman quickened her pace without looking back again. To anyone else, that wouldn't mean anything. To Thomas, it was a fact. Minutes later, a metallic sound echoed too quickly to attract attention. Something being closed or hidden. Thomas didn't turn his head. He simply registered the direction from which the sound had come. A side alley, rarely used at that time of day. He knew that alley. He knew who usually passed through there. He knew when it was empty. That day it wasn't. The veteran remained motionless, not out of indecision, but because acting without confirmation had always been the most costly mistake. He continued observing. He let time work in his favor. The city continued as normal. A truck unloaded goods. A child tugged at his father's hand. A radio played soft music inside a store. Everything screamed normality. That's when he noticed the second detail out of place. A car parked with the engine off, but with someone inside. The man in the driver's seat pretended to be using his cell phone, but his eyes weren't following the screen. They were looking outside, always at the same spot. The alley. Thomas felt that familiar inner tightness, that old feeling that didn't come from anxiety, but from recognition. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. He mentally cross-referenced the data, the nervous woman, the metallic sound, the car parked for too long. None of these things in isolation justified a reaction, but together they formed a picture he had seen before. In very different places, under much more violent circumstances. The context changed. Human behavior did not. Thomas adjusted his posture slightly. A small, almost invisible movement. He didn't stand up. He didn't change position. He simply prepared himself to continue observing for longer if necessary. He knew that, if this was what it seemed to be, it wasn't yet the time to act. Not yet. The third detail came in the form of absence. An absence that was all too specific. A man who usually swept the sidewalk at that time didn't show up. The owner of the corner store took longer than usual to open the door. Small delays. Small deviations. People reacting without realizing they were reacting. Thomas recognized this collective behavior. He had seen entire communities unconsciously adjust before something bad happened. He didn't feel fear, he felt responsibility. An old, heavy responsibility that he had tried to leave behind when he returned from the war. That feeling that noticing something and ignoring it was, in a way, participating in the mistake. But acting too soon also had consequences. He knew both options well, both exacted a price. The triggering event didn't present itself as a clear revelation. It was a slow accumulation of silent confirmations. A man leaving the alley in excessive haste, glancing back too quickly. A conversation interrupted mid-sentence when Thomas passed by. Averted glances, tense jaws, a diffuse nervousness, pervasive in the air that no one verbalized. Thomas finally got up from the bench, not in a hurry, not drawing attention. He walked a few meters, just enough to change his angle of observation. The car was still there. The driver was still feigning distraction. The alley remained too busy for that hour. Everything was going wrong in the right way to go unnoticed. He considered, for a moment, following his usual path, leaving, going back home, pretending nothing had happened. That was the safe choice, the choice that kept his life intact, silent, isolated. But the war had taught him something he could never unlearn. When patterns repeat themselves, ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. Still, he didn't act. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to solve anything. The calling event wasn't a call for immediate action. It was a call for vigilance, for preparation, for future decision-making. Thomas sat down again, now on a different bench, maintaining the same atmosphere under observation. Time passed slowly. Minutes that seemed too long. People continued to ignore everything. Life went on. But something had changed. Normality had cracked, even though no one noticed. When the car finally drove away, Thomas mentally noted the direction. When the alley was empty again, he realized he didn't feel relief. He felt confirmation. This wasn't over. This was only beginning. The calling event didn't demand that he speak. It didn't demand that he act. It only demanded that he accept an uncomfortable truth. The world around him was about to make a grave mistake, and he would be one of the few people capable of seeing it before it was too late. Thomas Hale returned home that night, his body weary, but his mind even more alert. The silence in the house seemed different, more tense. as if something had crossed the threshold with him. He didn't know exactly what was coming. He didn't know who would be involved, but he knew, with the certainty that only experience brings, that ignoring what he had seen was no longer a simple option. The calling event didn't shout, it didn't threaten, it didn't explain. It simply settled in, silently, like an invisible countdown. And Thomas, even reluctantly, even tired, had already begun to prepare for what would come next. The decision to act did not come suddenly. There was no clear moment when... Thomas Hale, he thought, now. What followed was a silent build-up, a growing weight that made it impossible to continue pretending that observation was enough. He had spent years building a life based on containment, on control, on the calculated distance between himself and the chaos of the world. That distance had always been his protection. But now, slowly, it was beginning to transform into a mission. And Thomas knew, with a clarity that deeply disturbed him, that there was a brutal difference between remaining invisible by choice and remaining invisible when someone needed to be seen. In the days following the triggering event, he didn't drastically change his routine. He woke up at the same time. He made his coffee the same way. He walked the same streets. To any outside observer, nothing had changed. But internally, everything was in motion. He mentally revisited every detail he had noticed, every broken pattern, every displaced behavior. Not as someone seeking emotional confirmation, but as someone organizing information before an operation he didn't yet know would happen. Thomas didn't want to act. That was the hardest truth to admit. To act meant to expose himself. It meant being seen, remembered, pulled back into a role he had painstakingly abandoned. To act meant risk, not just physical, but psychological. He knew well the price of intervening. He had paid it before. He knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to bear consequences that cannot be undone. There was one particular night when the internal conflict reached a critical point. He sat in the dark room of his house. No television, no radio, only the distant sound of the city falling asleep. Streetlights streamed through the window at regular intervals, creating shadows that moved slowly across the walls. Thomas kept his eyes open, fixed on nothing, while his mind simulated scenarios. What if he was wrong? What if he was seeing patterns where there were none? What if acting would cause more harm than inaction? These questions didn't come with easy answers. The war had taught him that absolute certainties almost never exist. What does exist are probabilities, calculated risks, and decisions made with incomplete information. And yet, decisions still need to be made. The act of courage didn't begin with confrontation. It began with silent approach. Thomas started adjusting his routes, his schedules, his observation points. Without drawing attention, he began to position himself closer to the places where the patterns had manifested. An alley, a street corner, a specific stretch of street where the movement didn't match the time of day. He didn't ask anything. He didn't interfere. He simply observed more closely. That's how he noticed something new. Not something spectacular, but something human. A young man, overly nervous, going in and out of the same building at irregular hours. A gaze constantly turned back. A bodily tension that Thomas recognized well. Not the tension of someone planning something with conviction, but that of someone being pressured beyond what they can bear. That changed the axis of the decision. Until then, the problem seemed abstract. A potential risk, a diffuse threat. But now there was a face, a behavior clearly shaped by fear. Thomas understood at that moment that the issue wasn't just preventing something bad from happening. It was preventing someone from being pushed into an irreversible mistake. And that activated something he had tried to keep dormant, the humanity that had survived the war. He still didn't approach immediately. Helping didn't mean intruding. He knew that poorly calculated interventions do more harm than good. So he waited. He observed a little longer. He confirmed. The pressure on the young man was mounting. The comings and goings were becoming more frequent, the nervousness more evident. Thomas felt the weight of the decision becoming unbearable. The moment to act arrived without fanfare. There was no dramatic music. There was no audience. It was an ordinary morning, with the city still waking up. Thomas crossed the young man's path seemingly casually. He didn't block his way. He didn't ask direct questions. He simply positioned himself there, present, as someone who didn't need lengthy explanations. He spoke little, very little, a simple sentence, neutral, nothing that sounded like a threat or authority, just enough to break the other's isolation. The young man hesitated. He looked around. He tried to maintain his composure, but the restraint failed. The accumulated pressure found a crack. Thomas listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He didn't offer quick solutions. He knew that sometimes the greatest act of courage is remaining calm in the face of someone else's chaos. His presence acted as an anchor, a stark contrast to the tense atmosphere in which the young man found himself. The skills Thomas employed at that moment were not the most obvious ones in warfare. They weren't strength, speed, or intimidation. They were emotional control, reading behavior, and careful choice of words. He steered the situation away from immediate danger without directly confronting the person exerting pressure. He reduced the risk. He bought time, enough time to break the cycle that was forming. When it was all over, there was no applause. There was no recognition. The young man walked away, confused, but visibly relieved. Thomas continued walking alone. No one realized what had been avoided. No one noticed that something had almost happened. And that was in keeping with the nature of the act. The internal conflict, however, did not end. On the contrary, acting even silently and humanely reopened doors that Thomas had kept closed for a long time. He felt the deep weariness that came not from the body, but from the mind. He felt the old weight return. The awareness that, once you choose to intervene, it is not possible to simply become invisible again. That night, at home, the silence felt different, less protective, more heavy. Thomas knew he had crossed an invisible line. There was no undoing what he had done. The courage he had shown lay not in the act itself, but in accepting the emotional consequences that would follow. He didn't regret it, but he didn't feel relieved either. Helping doesn't erase the past. It doesn't heal old wounds. It only reaffirms something essential. Even after everything, he was still capable of choosing humanity over absolute detachment. The act of courage had taken place, without spectacle, without speeches, without witnesses, and precisely for that reason, it had been real. After the silent act of intervention, Thomas Hale, he discovered that the real confrontation was no longer outside. It wasn't the city, it wasn't the people. It wasn't even the diffuse threat he had helped to disarm without anyone noticing. The greater conflict now resided within him, heavy, persistent, impossible to ignore. It was the kind of tension that doesn't explode all at once, but compresses slowly, like something that tightens the chest without ever completely suffocating. Acting had shattered the fragile balance he had maintained for years. Invisibility, once a reliable shield, had become unstable. He still walked the same streets, still sat on the same benches, still maintained the same outward silence. But inside, something had shifted. An entire axis had been displaced. Thomas felt that old responsibility again, that uncomfortable feeling of being too attentive in a world that insisted on remaining distracted. He began to perceive himself being observed, albeit subtly, not because anyone knew exactly what he had done, but because mere presence changes when someone crosses an internal line. People didn't approach him, they didn't ask questions, but some glances lingered a little longer than before. Conversations ceased when he approached, nothing explicit, nothing that could be pointed out, just enough for him to know. Remaining completely invisible was no longer a guaranteed option. This awakened an old fear. Not the physical fear, which he had learned to manage long ago, but the fear of being pulled back into a role he didn't want to resume. The fear of being seen as a problem solver, someone who acts when others hesitate. That label, he knew, comes with expectations, and expectations exact too high a price. The nights became more difficult. His sleep, which had already been light, became fragmented. Thomas would wake up without a start, but with his mind racing, revisiting every detail of what he had done, every word spoken, every timing choice. There was no regret. There was emotional exhaustion. the feeling that he was once again on unstable ground, where even the right decisions still leave their mark. During the day, the city seemed the same, but Thomas could no longer rely on this appearance of normality. He noticed how small conflicts arose and disappeared without anyone realizing it. How ordinary people dangerously approached mistakes that were too big to even notice. This intensified the internal conflict. To what extent was observation enough? And to what extent did omission become silent complicity? He began to distance himself even further from interactions, not out of indifference, but for self-protection. Every human contact now carried an added weight. A simple greeting could turn into an opening. A casual comment could become an implicit request. Thomas felt surrounded by possibilities he didn't want to acknowledge. He knew he couldn't save everyone. He knew it wasn't his job. But he also knew that ignoring clear signs was something he could no longer do. The greater conflict deepened in the form of memories that returned without warning. Not as intense flashbacks, but as silent associations. A specific sound recalled another time. A smell brought back a poorly resolved decision. He remembered situations in which he had warned and been ignored, of others in which he had failed to warn. The line between past and present became increasingly thin, almost imperceptible. Thomas began to wonder if he had truly left the war behind, or if he had merely changed scenery. The small town, with its predictability and apparent calm, now seemed like just another environment where chaos hid beneath layers of routine. And he, once again, was someone who saw it before others. This perception, which had once given him control, now weighed like a burden. There was also the fear of judgment. Not explicit judgment, but the kind that forms in silence. He feared being seen as strange, as someone who doesn't fit in, as someone who knows too much. Society, he had learned, tolerates comfortable ignorance better than constant surveillance. Being the one who observes too much is unsettling. It raises questions, it destabilizes. The conflict reached its peak when Thomas realized he was beginning to anticipate situations that didn't yet exist, not out of paranoia, but by default. He found himself planning alternative routes, assessing hypothetical risks, preparing for scenarios that might never materialize. This constant anticipation drained his energy. He felt the weight of always being one step ahead, never being able to fully relax. In a moment of painful lucidity, Thomas recognized something he had avoided admitting. The greatest obstacle was not the outside world, but the impossibility of switching off what had kept him alive in the past. Vigilance, restraint, calculation, all of these had been essential in the war. Now, in civilian life, these same tools threatened to isolate him completely. He wondered if it was possible to exist in another way, if there was a middle ground between total invisibility and constant exposure, but he found no easy answers. War doesn't prepare anyone for the ambiguity of peace. It teaches you to react to clear threats. Here, everything was too diffuse. The larger conflict wasn't resolved in a single moment. It stretched on day after day, accumulating emotional tension. Thomas felt tired of sustaining this intermediate state, but also unable to abandon it. There was a silent vulnerability in recognizing that he was no longer just a neutral observer. He had interfered, and that had made him part of the equation. At the end of another ordinary day, sitting alone at home, Thomas understood that he was on the verge of something irreversible. He didn't yet know what, but he knew that the internal conflict could not be ignored for much longer. Something inside him needed to break, or transform. The silence around him seemed heavier than ever. Not as shelter, but as pressure. And Thomas, exhausted, alert, and profoundly human, remained there, bearing the weight of knowing that sometimes the greatest confrontation requires neither weapons, nor words, nor movement. It only requires facing what has become impossible to avoid within oneself. The breaking point didn't come as a sudden impact. There wasn't a single event that could be pointed to as the beginning of the collapse. It formed slowly, like continuous pressure that finds no escape valve. Thomas Hale, he noticed it first in his body, even before he could organize any thoughts. A different kind of tiredness, deeper than physical exhaustion. A constant weight on his chest, as if breathing required an extra effort. The silence that had once served as a refuge now seemed to compress the space around him. The nights had become far too long. Thomas went to bed early, as always, but sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was light, fragmented, interrupted by awakenings without fright, without explicit nightmares. Just with the clear feeling that something was wrong, he lay in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the house, the creaking of wood, the distant hum of the electrical wiring, the wind rustling against the window, and realized that his mind no longer rested, not even in those intervals. The silence had ceased to be neutral, it had become oppressive. During the day, the city continued its predictable course. People walked, talked, laughed. Small conflicts arose and disappeared. Nothing seemed to demand immediate attention. And yet, Thomas felt out of place. Not because the world had drastically changed, but because he could no longer effortlessly fit into normality. Every daily gesture seemed to require a conscious choice. Every human interaction carried an emotional weight that he had previously been able to keep at a distance. The breakdown began to take shape silently when Thomas realized he was avoiding himself. He walked more, sat for less time, changed routes unnecessarily. He didn't want to stand still. He didn't want to face his own thoughts when the environment became too quiet. This was new. The silence, which had always been his most reliable tool, now threatened to expose him from within. There was one particular afternoon when the rupture came dangerously close to the surface. Thomas was sitting on a bench again, watching the street, when he noticed something mundane. A father impatiently calling his son, the child taking a while to respond. Distracted. Nothing wrong. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the tone of voice, the haste, the way the adult lost control for a second, all of this triggered something inside him. Not a clear memory, but an old feeling. The feeling of having seen small situations escalate too quickly. The feeling of knowing that mistakes rarely start out big. Thomas felt his body react before he could stop it. His muscles tensed, his breath became short. For a moment he was no longer there. Not completely. The city around him lost its sharpness. The sound faded. He closed his eyes for a few seconds, trying to anchor himself in the present. When he opened them again, he realized he was trembling slightly. That frightened him. Not because of the episode itself, but because of what it represented. He had always believed he was in control, that he had learned to live with what he carried, but there, sitting in broad daylight, in a safe environment, his body reacted as if it were facing a real threat. The past had crossed the barrier he had maintained for so long. From that day on, memories began to surface more frequently. Not as complete scenes, not as graphic images, but as sensory fragments. A distant sound recalled another sound. A smell brought back an old feeling. A pause that was too long in a conversation triggered a disproportionate state of alertness. Thomas didn't relive the war in images. He relived it in his body. The breaking point deepened when he realized something even more painful. He was tired of observing, tired of calculating, tired of carrying the silent responsibility of noticing what no one else noticed. That exhaustion didn't come from age nor from routine. It came from years of maintaining constant vigilance without permission to fail. On a particularly difficult night, Thomas sat on the living room floor, leaning against the wall, with the lights off. There was no theatrical despair, no uncontrolled crying. There was only a heavy emptiness, a feeling of utter exhaustion. He rested his head back and closed his eyes, letting the silence envelop him completely. For the first time in a long time, he didn't try to control it. The memories came in waves, comrades he hadn't been able to save, warnings that went unheeded, moments when simply observing wasn't enough. He felt the old guilt return with force, not exaggerated guilt, but that rational, persistent guilt that settles in when someone survives while others don't. Thomas realized he had never truly allowed himself to process it. He had moved on because he needed to. Now his body was demanding its due. The collapse wasn't a scream, it was a silent acknowledgement. The silence, at that moment, became almost unbearable. Not because it was empty, but because it was too full of unresolved memories, full of old decisions, full of an identity built around containment that was now beginning to crack. Thomas almost gave up. Not on life, but on continuing to be who he had been. For a moment, he considered abandoning vigilance altogether, pretending that nothing else mattered. Going back to being just another anonymous face, even if it meant ignoring clear signs, that idea brought temporary relief, and soon after, an even greater weight. He knew he couldn't do it. Ignoring had never been a real option for him. The most painful moment of the breakup came with the realization that he could no longer handle everything alone. Not in the sense of asking for immediate help, but in the sense of accepting that there were limits. That silent strength also runs out. That observing in silence does not mean being invulnerable. Thomas remained there for a long time, sitting on the floor, breathing slowly, letting the internal pressure manifest itself without resistance. That, in itself, was an act of courage unlike any other he had ever known. When he finally got up, the world hadn't changed. The house was still the same. The city slept. Nothing external indicated that anything profound had happened. But Thomas knew that something had broken inside him. Not destructively, but irreversibly. Absolute restraint was no longer possible. From then on, the silence would carry another layer. The moment of rupture offered no clear answers. It brought no resolution. It brought only a difficult truth. To continue observing the world in silence, he would first need to confront his own inner silence, and that would require more than vigilance. It would require transformation. Exhausted but strangely lucid, Thomas understood that he was on the verge of the most important point in his journey. He didn't yet know how he would act. He didn't know when. But he knew that after that night, nothing would ever be exactly the same again, before. The climax never materialized. There was no clear moment when Thomas Hale, he realized that everything that had been built up to that point was converging on a single point. He simply felt that the world around him was beginning to align in a strangely familiar way. Not comfortable, recognizable. It was the same feeling that preceded irreversible decisions in other times, in other places. The stillness before the movement. The pause before the choice. After the night of rupture, Thomas began to see the city with a different kind of clarity. It was no longer just automatic surveillance. There was intention. He wasn't just observing to protect himself, but to understand where it was all leading. The inner silence that had previously crushed him now functioned as a clean field where every thought emerged with clarity. There was no complete peace, but there was focus. The patterns he had been tracking began to fit together more precisely. Schedules, people, absences. Everything converged on a specific point, a short interval in which something would inevitably spiral out of control if no one intervened. It wasn't an emotional assumption. It was a cold reading based on repetition and human behavior. Thomas had seen this pattern before, many times, and he knew exactly how it ended when no one did anything. Still, he didn't act immediately. The impending breakthrough wouldn't be impulsive. It wouldn't be driven by anger, guilt, or a need for redemption. It would be driven by clarity. Thomas knew that acting at the wrong moment could destroy everything he was trying to avoid. The climax demanded absolute precision, not force, not speed, time. On that crucial morning, he followed his usual routine: coffee, a walk, discreet observation. To anyone else, it seemed like just another ordinary day. For Thomas, every minute had a specific weight. He positioned himself where he needed to be without drawing attention. He didn't get too close. He didn't stray too far, just enough to see without being seen. Silence became his ally once more. When the first unusual movement occurred, he confirmed what he already knew. A small, almost banal sequence that would go unnoticed by others. For him, it was the trigger, the beginning of the final unfolding. Thomas felt his body respond with that old readiness, but without unnecessary tension. There was no panic, just restrained action awaiting internal authorization. The climax wasn't violent. There was no direct confrontation, no public exposure. Thomas chose a different path. He intervened where it truly mattered, at the point of decision, a simple gesture, a strategic presence. a precise interruption in the wrong flow. He positioned himself between the choice and the consequence, not as a hero, not as an authority, as someone who knew exactly what was about to happen if no one changed course. He spoke little, a short sentence, neutral, without apparent emotion. As the seconds stretched out, he maintained a steady gaze, without challenge, without threat, simply present. The experience accumulated throughout his life of war and silence was all there, condensed into that minimal moment. He didn't need to prove anything, just endure. The other side's decision came in the form of a retreat, a step back, an interrupted gesture, an abandoned path. There was no applause. There were no conscious witnesses. But the situation had been resolved. The danger did not materialize. The point of no return was avoided. At that moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Not relief, but closure. An inner sense of closure, as if a line opened since the war had finally found a firm knot. He hadn't won anyone. He hadn't defeated a visible enemy. But he had faced his own deepest fear, the fear of acting again and bearing the consequences. The overcoming wasn't euphoric, it was silent. He withdrew unnoticed, resuming the city's normal rhythm. People continued walking. Conversations went on. Normalcy remained intact. And that was the clearest sign that he had done the right thing. The best outcome was one that left no visible marks. As he walked, Thomas realized that something inside him had changed permanently. The constant vigilance still existed, but it was no longer oppressive. The inner silence didn't crush him. It sustained him. He no longer felt the need to disappear completely, nor did he feel the desire to expose himself. He had found a middle ground, rare, fragile, but real. For the first time since returning from the war, Thomas didn't feel trapped between two worlds. He wasn't just the veteran observing in silence, nor someone trying to be something he wasn't. He was finally whole, with limits, with conscious choices, with the acceptance that his actions defined him not only by his past, but also by his present. The climax had passed, not as an explosion, but as a convergence. Everything that had accumulated, the silence, the observation, the restraint, the pain, the responsibility, had found a point of resolution. Thomas no longer needed to prove to himself that he was capable. He already knew. At the end of that day, sitting alone once more, he observed the city with a different gaze. Still attentive, still silent, but now without the constant weight of doubt. He had faced the exact moment. He had chosen to act when he needed to, and that was enough. Overcoming his challenges didn't transform him into a different man. It simply restored something he had lost along the way, the quiet confidence of someone who knows when to act, and especially when not to act. After the silent climax, life didn't change dramatically. There were no headlines, no comments spread throughout the city, or any explicit acknowledgement of what had been avoided. And that was exactly how Thomas Hale. I knew it would happen. Big changes are rarely announced. They settle in slowly, almost imperceptibly, and can only be noticed by those who pay attention to what happens after the danger has passed without leaving a trace. In the days that followed, the city returned to its usual rhythm. The same people crossed the same streets. The same shops opened and closed at the same times. Conversations remained trivial, stuck on matters too small to carry deep meaning. For everyone else, nothing had happened. For Thomas, everything had been internally reorganized. He woke up early as always, but now the silence of the house didn't seem oppressive. It remained dense, present, but no longer crushing. It was a habitable silence, a space where thoughts arose without urgency, without the constant pressure of anticipating tragedies. His body remained alert, conditioned by years of vigilance, but his mind no longer needed to fight against itself to find balance. Thomas returned to sitting on the same benches, observing the same corners, walking the same streets. The difference lay in the weight these actions carried. He no longer observed out of obligation. He observed by conscious choice. He had accepted that this was his nature, to perceive things first, to understand patterns, to sense when something didn't fit. But he had also accepted that this didn't have to consume him completely. Some people continued to ignore his presence. Others, curiously, began to notice him a little more. Not in a clear or invasive way. Just small signs, a discreet nod, a glance that didn't wander so quickly, a respectful silence as he passed. Thomas wasn't seeking this, he didn't feed on it, but he recognized that his demeanor had changed. Not externally, internally. And people, even without understanding why, perceive this kind of change. The past hadn't disappeared. The marks of war remained, inscribed on his body and mind. There were nights when sleep was still interrupted, days when a specific sound triggered an automatic reaction. The difference now was that Thomas didn't fight against these responses. He acknowledged them, accepted them, and let them pass. He no longer needed to prove his strength through absolute restraint. There was a simple, seemingly banal moment that clearly symbolized this transformation. Thomas was sitting again, observing the city, when a child dropped something on the ground and didn't notice. He stood up, picked up the object, and calmly called the child's attention to it. The child smiled, thanked him, and ran back to her parents. There was no tension, no over-analysis, just a human, natural gesture. Small, and yet significant. This gesture wasn't about heroic kindness, it was about presence. About being in the world without needing to hide completely, but also without exposing oneself more than necessary. Thomas was beginning to live in this intermediate space, rare and difficult to sustain, but possible. Over time, he realized he no longer carried the same internal urge to intervene in everything. He knew how to differentiate what required action from what required only attention. Experience, finally, was being used wisely, not just vigilance. He understood that true control lies not in anticipating all scenarios, but in trusting one's own ability to respond when the right moment arrives. The city continued to ignore many things. It continued to make small mistakes. It continued to underestimate invisible risks. Thomas knew this would never change. The world always prefers the comfort of distraction to the responsibility of observation. And that's okay. He didn't need to change the world. He didn't need to carry that weight. What had changed was his relationship with silence itself. Before, silence was a defense mechanism. Then, it became a burden. Now, it was a purpose. A space where he could exist in his entirety, without denying who he was, without getting lost in the past, without completely distancing himself from the present. Thomas finally understood that his journey wasn't about proving his worth, correcting injustices, or preventing tragedies at any cost. It was about accepting that some people are made to observe, to perceive, to sustain what others don't see, and that this, in itself, is already a form of silent contribution. At the end of another ordinary day, as the sun began to disappear behind the low buildings of the city, Thomas remained seated for a few minutes longer than usual. The wind blew lightly. The lights came on one by one. The world followed its predictable course. He breathed deeply, without haste, feeling his body present, grounded. Nothing needed to be resolved at that moment. Nothing needed to be done. And this realization, simple yet profound, brought a rare sense of peace. Thomas Hale would remain a silent observer. Not out of isolation, not out of trauma, but by conscious choice. His silence now did not hide pain. It carried meaning, it carried experience, it carried humanity. And if someone ever underestimated him again, if someone chose to ignore his presence, it wouldn't bother him. He knew who he was. He knew what he had lived through. He knew what he was capable of when the moment demanded it. Because in the end, the lesson remained clear. Not as a glaring warning, but as a quiet truth, impossible to erase. Never underestimate those who observe in silence.